So I have to hard to follow Dr. Johnson. He was tremendous. It was great. So we're going to talk about, it's a difficult subject, and what I would like to start out by saying is as I'm talking, when we talk about trauma, if sometimes things come up or memories or something I say or a story that might feel familiar with your own story, please take care of yourself. If you need to leave for a few minutes or step out, please do that. This is not an easy subject. So let me give you first, I want to give a little bit of an introduction of my journey that brought me here and why am I talking about trauma. My doctorate, my work is in historical theology and social ethics, so how am I talking about both personal and institutional trauma? And so before I was a professor, I was a social worker for many years, couple decades or so, and my first career, whenever I talk to a younger person who's thinking, what am I going to do with my life? I've had really 3 careers. And so if I'm talking to a 20-something, I'm like, don't worry about it. If you're going to go one direction, God might leave you in another. And that's how my life has been. I could never imagine doors that opened in my life. There was no really long-term plan. I started out as an elementary school teacher, teaching the inner city, both in Rochester at first and then in inner city in Providence, living in the same neighborhood as my kids, and it was this wonderful community experience, living in household, and we had soup kitchens and food and living with my kids. But it was because of that experience that led me into social work, because they had no money and they made me the school social worker, and I was a nice person, but I didn't know what I was doing. So I visit families, I cared about what was going on and why kids were coming to school hungry and so I thought, I better go get some education on this, and I had gotten a master's degree in theology only for the fun of it, and I always say to my students, it was my most fun degree, because I did it in the summers, and I just liked to read theology, but I had no idea it would ever be in my future. But I went and got an MSW, and at that time, there were no courses on domestic violence, there were no courses on trauma, or any of that. And again, I ended up working in the same neighborhood that I had been in with my kids in a community center. And my first client that walked in was someone who had been just slashed with a knife and terrible. And she started crying, telling about her story, but talking about her experience with the police and how they had asked her what she had done to deserve it. That led me into the world of domestic violence and eventually becoming director of battered women's shelters in Massachusetts. And doing that work led me into an interest in working with pastors, because I started listening to stories of women over and over would tell me stories. When I asked them about their support systems, family support system and community, it would come up. Well, do you belong to a church? You have a church family. And responses were generally, oh, I was, but I'm not now. Or they supported my husband or my partner, and they didn't feel they had a place. And it dawned on me, just as in social work school, I didn't have courses in domestic violence and trauma, these pastors didn't either. And I thought, okay, they have degrees, but some of what I was hearing that they were saying, even local pastors, a local pastor called me and didn't know me, I was new in the community of the shelter, and I actually remember putting the phone like this because he was yelling at me. He said, I know you have one of our women in your shelter. Don't you know you come in here, you're dividing up the community and families, and women need to stay, in the church, and we'll provide counseling for her. And I said, I waited till he stopped, and he said, obviously you're not a Christian. So I wait till he paused, and I said, first of all, I can't tell you who's in the shelter. That's confidential. Second of all, I am a Christian, and because I'm a Christian, that's why I'm doing this work. I really believe God wants women to be safe. And I know your belief is to keep families together, but she didn't cause this family to separate. You know, it was the abuser, the person that perpetrated this violence against her. So that led me into, I'm like, wow, how can we provide education for pastors and people in the church about how to respond and help women? So I started, and my church was very supportive of me, gave me a little office. This ministry, I just called it Grace for Justice, and I remember sitting on the floor and putting together binders for pastors with resources and information. Sometimes I would just go cold knocking on doors, like, hey, can we have a conversation? I have this for you. And started doing half-day trainings for pastors around these issues. And so I started listening to the pastors afterwards would come up to me and say, Beth, I have told women to stay in their marriage or work it out. Or one of the pastors said, I told her maybe if she was better in bed and just tried more. So between the stories of women and the stories of church leaders and pastors, actually that led me to go back to that I need the theological foundation and language to be able to talk to the church that this is this is the mission of God, right? Is to always be for life, for flourishing, for being there and being an ally and being with those women who are being traumatized. So that really allowed me to do some theological work in pulling together my experiences as a social worker, but also as a theologian. And so that's my background. Back then, and even 20, 30 years ago, we talked about trauma. I was trained more in family systems and cognitive behavioral therapies, but there wasn't a lot being said in terms of embodiment work and the work of what we now call kind of bottom-up work, using the body for healing, and understanding the physiology in what's happening in our brains when there is trauma. That is so important. Now I think about, wow, not to have this information to be working in the field, to me now it's impossible, that we all need to be trauma informed in our churches, but also understand how when we don't understand what's going on in the dynamics, we can become complicit in actually allowing trauma and violence to continue, right? And there, unfortunately, is a lot of complicity, not just within the church, but also within other institutions. So as we start, I've kind of divided this talk into a few different segments. One, I want to talk about the dynamics, which includes the physiology of trauma, what happens in our bodies. So I'm going to focus more on also individual effects and impact. So because of my background, a lot of my stories or references are about women who have been abused. That is not to say violence does not happen in relationships in other communities, certainly. But it's just kind of my experience and what I'm drawing from. And also, I want to talk about church response then. How can we be better in terms of caring for those who have been traumatized, but also recognizing the signs for caretakers and leaders, how it impacts us, and knowing our cues and what's going on in our own bodies, and also then what are institutional responses, or how can they improve. So let's just talk about some definitions. There's various, and because of the time, I'm not going to go deep into each one of these, but I do want to mention when we talk about trauma, we could be talking about acute trauma, vicarious or secondary trauma. Stress is a form of trauma and also can be an effect of trauma, ongoing chronic stress, or what people also term burnout. So with acute trauma, it's an event or an experience that results in immediate and long-term symptoms that impedes the ability to be fully present and integrated in one's life. An event or an experience that results in immediate or long-term symptoms, it impedes the ability to be fully present and integrated in one's life. And we'll talk about why that word integrated is so important. So in response, I know this much about physiology. I also would point to a great book. Everyone I know in this field that works would also probably hold up this book. And that's The Body Keeps Score. It's just a great book. Anyways, he says, in response to trauma itself and coping with the dread that persisted long afterwards, victims of trauma have learned to shut down brain areas that transmit the visceral feelings and emotions that accompany and define terror, because that's what's happening. Yet in everyday life, those same brain areas are responsible for registering entire range of emotions and sensations that form the foundation of our self-awareness, our sense of who we are. And then what happens is we get to adapt. Our brains are amazing, right? Our bodies are amazing, and they adapt over time to trauma. And this is also the problem for women who are being abused in a chronic way. And when I say abuse, I mean not just physical, sexual abuse, psychological, emotional, economic, right? Isolation. There's a lot of different types of abuse. And I've worked with many women who were not physically abused. One woman said to me, after a group that we held for abused women, she said, "Oh, I wish I had had bruises to show." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She said, "So many people, they don't believe me." And she had undergone awful psychological abuse and verbal abuse. But thought, oh, I got to show the bruises for people to see that I am a victim of abuse. So what happens is our frontal lobe, our orbitofrontal cortex, during a traumatic experience, it kind of shuts down. I'm thinking right now of, and maybe all of you as I'm talking can think of an experience. I don't want you to go too deep here. But just it could be any type of trauma. It could be the death of a loved one. I was thinking this morning, I was just thinking about driving to Rochester. I was living in New England, driving to Rochester one winter. I'm in Western Massachusetts on Route 90. And I noticed cars off to the side of the road. And then to my alarm, a couple cars looked like in the middle of the road. I'm like, why is everyone stopping? At the same time, my brain is registering the black in front of me is black ice. And I did what you're always told not to do and put my foot on the brake. Went spinning around. And interestingly, I had no control, but I was at peace. What was happening was, I wasn't thinking about this at the time, but looking back on it, endorphins were rushing through my brain, my body. My brain was quick to try and protect me in that way, and I had peace, and miraculously, I spun and came up across the side of the road, up against a pole, but not touching it. So that was So the next year, whenever I drove that stretch of road again, not thinking about it, and matter of fact, it was warm weather, not thinking at all where I was, my body tensed up, and all of a sudden I thought, why do I feel so anxious? It was kind of strange. I was kind of looking like, what, and I realized it was the exact same place that had happened previously, that traumatic experience. Our body registers about 80% of our knowledge. So that's why if you sense things, or you see it with little kids are really great about this, right? Someone comes up to them and they back up, or they don't want a hug, right? So we say, let children, teach children to be in tune with their bodies and to know how to be safe in their bodies without pressuring, right? Go hug Uncle Joe but we know we get information from our senses. Actually, our body, we see things before it registers in our brain. But so this part of our brain is the executive part of it that's thinking through. You know, how do I solve this problem? Oh, this just happened. What am I going to do? Right? And in most times when we're not in trauma, we can figure that out, or we can take the time, say, what do we do next? Or, oh, I don't like this. But that's our executive function happening. That shuts down because we're in this trauma right now, and what takes over is which is close by, the amygdala, right? That's your response if you have kind of thought about some type of trauma you may have gone through. A fight, you've all heard of this, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. So some of our responses can be because of the situation that is happening. Sometimes it's our personality too. Some people just tend to freeze up, right? Some people withdraw. That's kind of a running away, right? They remove themselves quickly. They're in flight. Or maybe fight if they feel threatened enough. One of my clients called me. She said, I was arrested. I said, arrested for what happened? Now, she had been and still living with her husband in a very abusive situation. And she said, I saw him in the backyard. And this is an experience, so this is chronic. And she knew what it meant. She said, I saw the look in his eyes. She knew what that meant. He was in the backyard, she was in the kitchen, there's a screen door between them. But seeing his eyes as he's running towards her, he's so angry, he pushes the screen door, he puts his fist or something through it, and he got cut, right, to get to her. But in the meantime, someone else was in the house, called the police. She ended up not with any bruises or anything. The police arrested her because said, well, look at what the cuts and scratches on his arm because of that, right? So that's, again, a lesson about context is important and the story is important. But she was aware and in trauma and knew for her to survive this, she was going to freeze and just, step back from that. We know that from when I work with rape victims, oftentimes they'll describe being out of their body. I feel like I was out of my body and I wasn't in it when it happened. They're frozen, right? Their body freezes, a way of protecting them from feeling the pain of that injury. And then the hippocampus is important because around the memory of the trauma, often because the executive function isn't really operating right, you often later, when hearing a story, and this is important for the church or those listening or thinking, I wonder if she's being abused. She didn't tell me a story of abuse. I didn't get all the details. This happened 10, 20 years ago, or why? Well, it could be she can't tell the story. Her memory might be one of when she smells a certain cologne, it triggers her. right? So it could be attached to smell or touch or someone else telling a similar story. So the memories are attached to the sensory information at the time of the trauma. So oftentimes then, so I mean it's disintegrated then, fragmented, the actual traumatic experience sometimes, depending on what that is. Now imagine if it's abuse and it's chronic. This is happening again and again, which raises your levels of cortisol, which is your stress hormone, right, to deal with it. That is not good for the rest of your body, right? It really impacts your body. Anyone here have children who might be a little anxious about maybe the first day of school or a new experience, and they say, Mommy or Daddy, I've got a stomach ache, I've got, and if you listen, you can't discount it because they really do have a stomach ache. Something's going on in their body is responding to that stress and that anxiety, right? We all have physical symptoms of that. And we feel it, depending on who we are, in different ways. And we'll talk about cues in a few minutes and about learning our cues. But that's important to know as church and as church leaders, that because I've heard pastors say that, well, he's such a good guy. I had one pastor say, Beth, he's the best worship leader, and he's so calm, and and I said, that's who you see. So not believing the stories, what goes on behind closed doors can look very different than what is happening on the altar. And if I could do anything today, is to say, please believe that. And for years, I also worked with perpetrators of abuse. We started the first certified program in southeastern Massachusetts. We had a couple of sites in every group. I had 20 guys. I co-led these groups. It's a 40-week program. And I can tell you, after years of listening to men talk about, because that's the first thing they had to do, they had the first 8 weeks, they had to talk about what be accountable, tell their story without, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, minimizing, denying, or victim blaming. In other words, be truthful about what happened. And we knew what was truth and what wasn't because we had police reports, so we could tell that. That it was important to really understand that these guys, when they told the truth, some of the things that they shared, they talked about, and how they fooled people, right? They got by. And they would start the program trying to fool. That wasn't, divide and conquer. So they would come to me, for example, and say, oh, my probation officer said I didn't have to really be here because I'm in alcohol counseling, so I don't have to be here. I'd say, oh, let me check on that. And because it was a community intervention program, this is also important, right? And he signed waived confidentiality. I could call the alcohol counselor down the street or the probation officer. And probation officers I would call immediately and say, he just said that you said he doesn't have to be here. Beth, you know me, I never said that. Of course he has to be there. But that's kind of divide and conquer. But that happens in churches too. Oh, the pastor's being tough on me. So it goes to someone else for sympathy. And I remember one of the men, the first week he came into group, he came in with his pastor. And I said to the other counselor, I've got this. So I went over to the pastor, may I help you? Oh, I just wanted you to know he shouldn't be here. I'm counseling him. And the court really blew this up. It was just one incident, minimizing, right? Victim blaming, talking about her, it's a problem with her too, going on. I said to him, you know what? You're not helping him. You're not helping him. I'm happy to work with you if he signs away confidentiality, but if the court ordered him for 40, well, he's got to pay for it. Yes, that's part of accountability. You've got to pay out of pocket. You've got to sit in the seat every week for 40 weeks. But you know what? After 40 weeks, if he does the program and is held accountable, then there'll be a change. That's for his good. That's not just we're punishing him, right? And that's what I want to say about when we talk about loving others, right? And my good friend Dr. Graves spoke at chapel yesterday about God wants flourishing, right, of human beings and communities. Yes, even those who are abusive, God wants them to stop being abusive and traumatizing folks, right? And traumatizing women. One of the reasons I got involved in working with abusive men at the same time I was running shelters was because, like, the problem isn't the women. We can care for the women, right? The problem is those who are committing violence. And the support around those who are committing violence. And the pastor listened to me and he said, I hadn't thought about it like that it would help him. I said, yes, so in a way he went to the chagrin of the client who came with him. But this is not, as Martin Luther King, often talked about, we're not trying to have power over the white racists. We're trying to win them over. That's hurting them too, right? It's those who are traumatized, but those who are causing trauma are also being hurt. So that is some of just the physiology. If you're wondering, some of you may have heard several years ago, Christine Blasey Ford, who gave testimony in front of a Senate committee during a judicial hearing for Supreme Court justice, tell her story of abuse years ago by this candidate. And if you listen to her story, she tells bits and pieces. She talks about, she remembers the sound of the boys coming up the stairs. She remembers going down the stairs and seeing the door, just going for that door. And in houses that were built after the house she was living in, she insisted, her husband later said, I wondered why she had to have two front doors. She insisted always on having two doors in the front of the house. She remembered the smell of beer in the room and the laughter. She didn't tell, because the question that came back to her over and over, why are you just telling this story now? Or, what do you mean, you don't remember where the party was that this happened? You don't remember, she wasn't believed by many people. Matter of fact, I remember that day getting a text from a friend saying, do you really believe her? Yes, because those are the stories I've heard for years. You'll hear from, okay, on May 7th at 6 o'clock, and then telling me a clear story. They're telling pieces of that. I remember working with a young college student, this is many years ago, and when she came in, I could tell shame was all over her. I'm a really good Christian, young woman, I grew up, my father's a judge, telling me her background about what basically a good girl she was, is what she was trying to say to me. And talking about there was such extreme physical violence by her boyfriend, who ultimately got arrested because of damage on that college campus he had done, not because of what was going on with her. It took months for her to tell me he played Russian roulette with a gun, loaded gun, to her brain. And months after that, I suspected, I knew it, I was waiting for her to be able to get integrated enough, right, of the memories and the sensations in her story to pull it together where she could start talking then about the rapes. So that's something to keep in mind, because I hear that, I said this to someone I was helping out a few weeks ago, listening to her story, grew up in a Christian home, church every Sunday, married for almost 20 years, church every Sunday with her kids. She could not take the emotional, psychological, verbal abuse, no physical abuse, could not take it anymore. And she thought what was best for her and the kids was to leave. She said, what happened to me in the church? She said, no one asked me what happened when I left. It was all about, when are you going to get back into the marriage? The pastor called and said, we have to do couple counseling. We have to get you two back together. No one listened to her story. I said, you know what? Every time I talk now to church audiences, I keep talking about being really careful about listening and not judging or coming to assumptions until you know what is going on, right? And you know what her response was? And I was holding it together because I wanted to burst into tears, was, they don't listen to you. They won't listen to you. That's the way the church is. Listen to another woman before that, several months before that, same thing, great, being a member of a great church, that separated, and she said, all I did was feel pressure to get back together with him. So when I hear people say, why are young people like not going into church or not, you know, I said, well, I can tell you why a lot of women have left church, or they don't. And I always encourage people, find a church that will nurture you, listen to your story, and be with you, and be with you in the trauma. It's not just about being trauma-informed, and I saw that recently. A Justice Church is trauma-informed. Yes, that's a first step. But we need to be allies, and we need to be in solidarity with those who are being traumatized, whether it's abused women or it is groups of people who are being objectified and denigrated, because that is traumatic also. So I just want to say something about children very quickly. We all take roles when we're children. And I'd like you, as I'm talking, to think about your own childhood. We all do as human beings, tend to, in families, take certain roles, right? And some of it has to do with birth order, maybe your gender, our personality for sure, sometimes as a result of trauma or stress in the family. So some of the survival responses we have, even in healthy families, we take on roles, is to be the dutiful child, the caretaking child, an adjuster. This is the kid that just says, oh, nothing bothers the kid, you know, just kind of goes with the flow. I've heard many women who come into the shelter say, well, I left because I realized it's starting to affect my child, but never affected before. I always say, if a child is in the home where there's any kind of stress, trauma, abuse, I don't care if they're behind the door in their bedroom. They know what's going on in that home. They feel it in their bodies if they don't know or understand the details of it, right? And so you take a role to survive it. Again, God made us in such an amazing way to survive, to flourish, right? To have life. Or we act out. Back at the community center when I used to work, parents would come in to talk about their teens acting out. I don't know what's going on, Beth, with, you know, and I'd always, when I found out what the story was with the teen, I'd say, that's actually a healthy response. That child is acting out their stress. They're getting it out, whether they're going off doing whatever they're doing. That's in a way like saying to everybody, hey, I'm in trouble. I'm not going to tell you what's going on right now, or I don't have the words, or I'm confused, but I'm in trouble. That's not unhealthy. We try and manage the behaviors, right? And we're socialized that way. And sometimes, unfortunately, that happens unwittingly in churches. We socialize children, right, to act a certain way, to be nice. You know, I was always saying this to my daughter. You have permission, if you don't feel comfortable with someone, This happened, someone came actually into my yard and started talking to her when she was out in the backyard, and I was in the kitchen. I didn't know. And even though I had said I try and reinforce this, honey, well, I was trying to be nice, Mommy. No, you don't need, I give you permission, don't be nice. You can run. You don't feel safe? You can run, you come right to me, you tell me anything, right? So we need to talk about this in the home, but we need to talk about this with children in churches too. And a few years back, I was talking to a young college woman who there was a liturgy around, I think it was probably April, Sexual Assault Month, so we had a little prayer thing around for victims. She said, I was walking by, because it was out in a main area, I was walking by and I stopped and I listened in to what people were praying about. She said, I was shocked. I thought I was the only one. She grew up in a great Christian family, went to church every Sunday. She said, I was raped when I was about 7 years old by a neighborhood boy. She said, only thing I remember is sitting in a dark closet curled up. That was her response. She ran, right? With her brain's like, I gotta run. And she hid. And she never told anyone that story. And she said, I always thought I was the only one because I went to church and no one ever talked about it. She joined a teen group. She said, in teen group, we always talked about abstinence and the girls need to be, careful. She said, I always felt dirty because I'm not a virgin. And so we had to talk through what that meant for her. And she said, I never felt like I was the other girl. She said, now I realize there might have been other girls in the group who were sexually abused or raped. And I said to her, if you're in a church, you are sitting with teens and women, boys and men who have been raped and sexually assaulted. And we need to be truthful about that and talk about that. So she was in college before she felt like she could talk because she wasn't alone. What would have happened, and after I heard her story, I'm like, every time I talk, I'm going to talk about the importance of teen groups and what do we do with the children in our churches, and having safe places to talk about this reality and talk about dating violence. The number of girls that are abused on a date, guess what ages that happens most? Age 18 to 24. Why? That's when they're usually out there dating the most, right? So why aren't we talking about that in our churches? That needs, I think, to happen. So I have gotten off a bit here. So I just wanted to mention that about children, because we don't grow up and wake up at age 18 on our birthday and say, okay, I'm fine now, right? I'm not going to keep acting out in those, I'm okay. We carry those into adulthood in those symptoms. So even in our workplace or our families, where we continue sometimes those roles, and if we're not aware and kind of catch them, why do I always just step back? Or why do I always need to be the dutiful child and the one taking control and all of that? What is that about, right? So it protects us from further trauma. Our brain has learned to cope and operate and survive in a way, and then it can become a pattern that can be dysfunctional. I'm just going to check my time here. Oh, it's so fast. All right, so some of the adult symptoms: agitation, hostility, hypervigilance, self-destructive, emotional, anxiety, loneliness, numbing, or what I call disassociation. Remember I talked about episodes where you feel separated from what's going on. That can become a pattern of the way you deal with trauma or abuse. You just always find yourself separating. symptoms, anxiety, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, combativeness, numbness, emotional detachment. It's working with a couple of young women, almost no affect, very difficult. And they had been sexually abused over and over as children. And so their brains had protected them, separated out, right? And did not, their emotions weren't fully integrated, right? That's what healing will do, is to integrate those emotions and allow you to go to a place where you can be vulnerable without feeling like you're dying or falling apart. I'm going to skip this just because of time. So I want to talk about the impact. And I've already told some stories. But let's also talk about churches and church response to groups that are sometimes denigrated or traumatized. I don't know if some of you have heard the story about the Olympic USA gymnastics team. Many of the girls had been sexually assaulted by the team doctor over years. And even when it came out, or when it was first reported by a couple of the girls, nothing happened, nothing was done. And I remember an interviewer asked Allie Reisman, one of the gymnasts, why do you think that is? Why do you think he wasn't like immediately arrested or there wasn't action? And she said a great thing, a quote that I have used many times: denial is easier than devastation. Denial is easier than devastation. And I found that also with churches and also working with pastors, to talk about what's really going on, right? And talk about the prevalence of violence can be devastating. Or I don't really want to call the police, or I don't want to call on him. He's a good guy. I had a probation officer once say to me, Beth, you know, he only happened once. Why are we going to prosecute this case? And I said, if he was a bank robber, would you say, well, he only robbed one bank, let's let him go, right? But we minimize denial, minimization, and then sometimes even victim blaming are not just ways that we see perpetrators acting, but also institutions. You know, how many times that story recently, and I don't remember the name of the church, but a mega church in Texas, where there was abuse of a minor a couple decades ago, and it was covered over, and well, it was just, you know, it was a mistake. It was a moral failing. No, it was a crime. It was a crime. And the church then should have called the police. You know, well, he's the pastor, he's done so much good. I've heard that so many times, right? Or a leader. It's a crime, and you're not, again, I keep saying this, you're not doing any favors to those who perpetrate violence. And you are part of the problem. You are part of the problem. I was talking to one woman, she said, Beth, and I had to work through, because she didn't understand, she was supposed to be submissive to him and stay in the marriage, and he was really, for a long time, physically abusive. And she said, but that's what, you know what, my husband, he's a leader in the church, and if you knew him, and if he was sitting right here, he could recite the whole Bible to you. You know, I said to her, I'm not impressed. I don't know, can Satan recite the whole Bible? I said, he might know the words in this Bible, but he doesn't understand them. He doesn't know the meaning of them, which got her attention. I said, that's not what that verse means. Like, did he also tell you where it says husbands to love your wives and what that means, right? But see, that's part of an institutional support of violence, is the support of him, right? Or a woman who left the church, she's a wife of a pastor in New England, and even the physical abuse, she went to the deacon, she said, listen, I've got to leave, he's physically abusive to me. They did not remove him. And then months, she was devastated because it was leave. She said, it's leaving my family again. There's trauma on trauma. She ends up having an affair, and he's removed then. And she said to me, wow, so they took that seriously, he's having an affair, but the fact he was physically beating me meant nothing, right? Institutional collaboration, collusion with violence, and we need to be honest and truthful about what's going on. This is that book, The Body Keeps Score. It's one of my another favorite quotes. Safety and terror are incompatible, right? We need to create safe spaces in our churches. I like listening circles where women can come together, listen to each other's stories. If you do it right and have training, you can have women talking about their stories where men on the outside are just listening. They're not allowed to talk. They're listening to the stories, and then they can reflect on what they heard, right? And the same is true, experience with men talking about their childhood experiences of gender violence and women on the outside listening, which is very powerful too, in reflecting. So this is a community flourishing and being honest about what's happening. So healing has to do with integration then of these memories, emotions, experience from the trauma. We can move through and help people tell their story and remember the past without allowing the past hold us captive, right? So it's not forgetting what's happened, but it doesn't imprison us anymore. And if we're really vulnerable and honest, how much easier it is also then to be an ally with those who are suffering too and oppressed. And if you're sitting there saying, well, I've never, been abused or assaulted or whatever, you probably, though, can think about times in your life where you have felt deeply hurt and vulnerable and in pain, right? And draw from that to be in solidarity, not just show compassion and empathy, but go deeper than that and actually be in solidarity. So some of them, we don't have time for this, but what we call bottom up. Remember I said we get knowledge and feeling through our body, and we need to integrate that. Some physical activity, there was a study done that got my attention like 25 years ago, and they had a control group where people did not receive therapy or anything. One group that did therapy and exercise, walking I think it was, and then the third group just got therapy. Guess which group ended up doing the best? Those that were walking, moving their bodies, and in therapy. So we know Pilates and yoga and these types of things. It's been used with children of war, and I heard one speaker talk about going over with a team, and I forget what country he was in. They got the stories from kids who had been in this war zone. They're totally traumatized, frozen. Worked with them doing dancing and shaking their bodies and doing different things, and then afterwards, and he said in a short amount of time, like 3 or 4 weeks, we saw the kids laughing and emoting again. What they were doing was they are integrating through physical movement these experiences and their stories, which help them. So now, I say don't go to a therapist unless he or she understands the importance of embodiment and body movement and so forth. It's just so key and understand the physiology of trauma. I gotta look at my clock. I'll just mention this and we're not going to have time for the exercise, but maybe I passed it. Cues, yeah. So when I was working with the men, at the end of 40 weeks, I would ask, what was most helpful in the program? Almost always, I wish I had kept track, I'd say over 90% of them said, learning my cues. Learning my cues. And I think that's true for all of us. It's helpful for me. So if I have a strong emotional response to something, just something going on or something someone said that maybe none of you would have, I now kind of stop, pay attention to what's going on with me that this is triggering something where I just, all of a sudden, I feel furious about. Or I'm feeling that. That's my emotional cues. I want to pay attention to that. What's happening in my body? For some people, their stomach tightens up, right? For me, I get tight up here. So learning what goes on in your body, and you might want to practice this, and say this to yourself, next time you're in any kind of stressful situation or traumatic, what's going on in your body, physically, emotionally, and what are you thinking? Sometimes we have negative thinking that we're not really so conscious of until we stop a moment and say, now I just made a judgment in my head about that person, what they just said. I'm gonna stop that thinking. Why did I just think that? Or why am I thinking, hey, that stereotype sounds a little true, is it? And so stopping that and learning about replacing it with some positive cognitive cues. But some of this is practicing, and the perpetrators in my classes, this was very helpful because they learned before they would come into groups saying, well, I don't know, I just slapped her, I lost my temper. And I would say, well, it has to go through your brain. You have to think about your arm does not operate separately. It's going through, even if it's a split second or a few seconds, you made a decision. And it's actually very empowering that to learn, I made a decision to do this. You can stop, find out where those 5 seconds are before we open our mouths or before we judge somebody. Slow it down, right? And say, what's going on? What am I thinking? Before it comes out of my mouth, right? So those are cues that are really helpful, and I think it's helpful for the church and for organizations as a whole to practice their cues in a lot of different situations. So I want to talk a little bit about secondary. Let me just say this to those of you who are caretakers, who are in justice work. You have a different kind of trauma, secondary trauma maybe. If you're in it long enough, you're hearing stories, it impacts you. It's a different kind of trauma. Years ago, I experienced this. I had doubled the number of groups I was doing. I was doing 6 with men on top of the work with women. That's 120 men a week I was seeing in groups and hearing their stories, and I started having nightmares every night. And one morning I woke up and I thought my whole body, I felt like I had been beaten up in my sleep. I even remember looking at my arms, did someone come in and beat me? Like I felt like I had been bruised. So I was carrying it in my body, and I mentioned it to my coworker, and he said, don't come in on Tuesday night. Don't come in. And guess what I did? Feeling like dutiful, I showed up to work. And he met me at the door, and he said, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here, right? And I listened to that. I thought, oh, I need to take a vacation. So I went away to visit my sister out of state. That entire week I was away, I had no nightmares, no nothing. I'm like, oh, I think there's something to post-secondary stress and trauma, right? And from then on, I came back and cut down the number of groups I had back to what it was. And you have to do that. Those of you in justice work, pastoral work, any kind of this, you have to think of the reality that it impacts our brains too and our bodies, right? So I'm gonna finish up by saying just this, because I want to go back a second just to institutional violence and being in solidarity with those who are being oppressed. and I wasn't going to go here, but I'll go here. So, someone told me this is a friendly group, so I'll do it. So those who are being objectified in our society, we need to stand with them every chance we get. I had an opportunity a few years ago to go to, actually it was the Christian Development Conference. It was a regional conference in El Paso. And I was able to go over the border to Juarez and I was just there to listen to those in the shelter and their experiences. It was very powerful. And the one thing, and I said, I'll go back and I'll say this again. At first I was embarrassed when they kept saying, just tell them we're human beings. First I was like, do they think Americans don't think they're human? That was their experience. Tell them we're human beings and we just want to be safe and we just want our families to be safe, right? That they felt so objectified. And then recently when we hear the denigration of people of color, of the Haitians, whose lies and stories are told and repeated over and over and over. Interview last week with a Haitian community leader in Springfield. He's on camera saying, we didn't feel safe in Haiti, that's why we're here. And by the way, we're here legally. That's why we're here, and now we don't feel safe in our community anymore. If we need to say, that's traumatic, right? They experience trauma, they come here, and they're being re-traumatized. And we could say, well, we're not saying those things. I wouldn't say those things. But we need to stand up and think about, as churches, well, how can we be an ally to them? What can we do? Maybe we can call a pastor in Springfield. What can we get for you? What can we do for you? Does your community center need something? I don't know. Every chance we get, because this happens over and over with groups, right, that today we can go back and talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and, I would have been part of the confessing church and not the German. I wouldn't have gone along with the Nazis. Well, today we have groups that are oppressed and are suffering, and when we hear it, we can't just laugh about it, because that might be our impulse to laugh because it just seems outrageous, but we need to stand with these people and speak up for them, speak up for women who are being abused, give the message somehow out there. I don't care if it's brochures, what it is. October's Domestic Violence Month. We need to get up and say that. I had a pastor one time say to me, Beth, I don't need to get up in the altar and talk about that there shouldn't be abuse in the family. That's obvious. I said, guess what? It's not. I said, get up there. He did. In October, he got up and spent a Sunday talking about the devastation of violence against women, the marginalization of women. And it was later he said to me, all these women came up to me and told me about their abuse story. He said, I didn't know that. That was part of their story. But you know what? He gave permission for that to happen. He listened, he opened it up, he talked about. So we need breathing spaces and safe spaces, right? For those in our church and for our kids and our teenagers. Let's talk about the reality with them of sexual assault and rape and abuse and dating violence, because wouldn't you rather them hear it in church with people who love them, right, and can come alongside? Give them permission to talk about their experiences. Thank you very much for your patience. I'll be around.